Hello and welcome to Impact Tuition. We are glad to come your way with another exciting video lesson on the ICA Ghana Strategic Case Study. We are still discussing the business environment as part of strategic position. And in this video, we'll talk about the industry environment and competition with focus on Porter's 5 forces framework. From our previous discussions, we've understood that strategic management is a process and involves strategy identification, selection, and implementation. Under strategic position or strategy identification, we talked about 3 key issues: purpose and expectation, the business environment, and strategic capabilities. We've talked about purpose and expectation in a previous video. If you haven't watched, kindly go to the list of videos and there's the video on purpose and expectation. We are now talking about the business environment. Under the business environment, we've already talked about the macro environment, and the model discussed was the PESTEL framework. There's the video on this as well. Kindly check it out. Now we are on the industry environment, and that will be the focus of our discussion in this video. We will talk about Porter's 5 forces and how Porter's 5 forces is applied in analyzing the competitive environment of the industry. Industry environment and competition. An industry consists of companies which produce similar goods and services. Within an industry, there may be different segments. A segment or a sector in an industry is a separately identifiable part of a larger industry. An example is the insurance industry, where we have different segments, and we can have the general insurance, life assurance, and pensions. These are all segments of the insurance industry. Now, because we are talking about strategy, it is important that companies make strategic decisions about 2 things. First, the industry and industrial segment or segments they intend to operate in, and the market or markets in which they sell their goods or services. When the companies have reached these decisions, then there is the Porter's 5 forces framework, which is a method for analyzing the competitive environment of an industry. And when this is done, we will understand the attractiveness of an industry in terms of its profitability. So our discussion in this video will be on Porter's 5 forces, which is a model for analyzing the industry, and how we will apply the framework in analyzing the competition in the industry. An industry consists of companies which produce similar goods and services. We've already talked about that. Let's look at the generic types of industry. There is the fragmented industry. In a fragmented industry, firms are small and sell to a small portion of the total market. A very good example of a fragmented industry is the cleaning service industry, or the shoe repair industry, hairdressing services, and dry cleaning services. Firms in a fragmented industry are small and sell to a small portion of the total market. We have the emerging industry. An emerging industry is an industry that have only just started to develop and are likely to become much bigger and much more significant in the future. A very good example is the space travel industry, which is just beginning to bud with great potential in the future. A third type of industry is the mature industry, where a very good example is the telecommunication industry in Ghana, obviously. These are industries where products have reached the mature phase of their life cycle. With the telecommunication industry in Ghana, it is obvious that the industry is a mature industry because the products have reached their mature phase, and in this phase we experience a lot of competition among the players in that industry. The fourth type is the declining industry, and these are industries that are going into decline. The total sales are falling and the number of competitors in the market is also falling. An example is the compact disc industry, which is not being used much these days. Then the last type of industry is the global industry. And a good example is the automobile industry and then the professional football industry. These industries operate on a global scale with players across countries in the world. Analyzing the industry. Having understood the industry and the various segments and the generic types of an industry, let us look at how Porter's 5 forces is applied in analyzing the industry. Porter's 5 forces helps determine the determinants of competition and the factors that influence profitability in an industry. The forces. Porter's 5 forces is made up of 2 threats, 2 powers, and 1 rivalry. For the threats, there is the threat of new entrants and the threats from substitutes or the availability of substitutes. The 2 powers, the powers of the customers and the powers of suppliers. The rivalry between firms in the industry. In an exam situation, we would have to discuss whether the force will make competition stiff or weak. We should note that innovation is the main driver of competition. Where there is high innovation, there is stiff competition, and vice versa. Low innovation, the competition in the industry becomes weak. Now we will look at each of these forces and the factors to consider in each of them. Threat of new entrants. For threat of new entrants, we will look at the barriers to entry. Now, what happens when the barrier to entering the industry is low? When barriers to entry are low, it presents a situation where new entrants are able to come into the market without much difficulty. Firms already in the market are likely to keep prices low and to meet customer needs as effectively as possible. As a result, competition in the market will be strong and there will be no opportunities for high profit margins. Let's look at the situation where the barrier to entering the industry is high. So when barriers are high. When barriers to entry are high, It is difficult for new competitors to enter a market. Existing competitors are under less pressure to cut their costs and sell their products at low prices. So this is typically what happens when barriers to entering an industry is high. We are going to discuss factors that might help to create high barriers to entering the industry. The first is economies of scale. Economies of scale is about the ability of an entity to produce in very large quantity and as a result reduce their average costs. In an industry where economies of scale are large and the biggest firms can achieve substantially lower costs than smaller producers, it is much more difficult for a new firm to enter the market. So where there's an already existing competitor or the industry leader is able to achieve economies of scale, it is difficult for a new firm to enter the industry and compete. Capital investment requirement. If a new entrant to the market will have to make a large investment in assets, this will act as a barrier to entry and deter firms from entering the market when they do not want the investment risk. Know-how. Where the technical know-how to enter the industry is expensive and time-consuming for a new entrant to acquire, the new entrant will obviously not enter and will stay out of the market or of the industry. Access to distribution channels. In some markets, there are only limited number of distribution channels. And if those distribution channels are in the control of existing firms or the industry leaders, it is difficult for a new firm to enter the industry and compete. Government regulations. Sometimes regulations within an industry can make it difficult for new entrants to break into the market because access to the market has been given to a particular firm by the government. And as a result, it is difficult to enter the market for new firms wishing to break into such industries. Then there's the final one, which is the switching cost. Switching costs are costs that a buyer has to incur in switching from one supplier to a new supplier. In some industries, the switching cost can be quite high, and as a result, it is difficult for people to switch to a new entrant, even if that new entrant is able to penetrate the industry. We look at the second threat. Threat from substitute products or services. Substitutes are products that serve the same or similar purpose. An example is the transport industry, where consumers might switch between air, rail, and road transport services. Factors to consider when it comes to the threat from substitute products or services. The first is existence. For the substitute to pose a threat, it must first exist. If it exists, then we can talk about the performance. How does the substitute product or service perform in relation to the product in question? If the substitute performs better than the product in question, then it poses a threat. If it doesn't, there's nothing to worry about. Relative price. Consumers are very keen on the prices of the product. So if the prices if the products serve the same purpose and one is relatively higher, consumers will go in for one with the relatively lower price. Fashion trends can also determine how consumers go in for the substitute products. If it is the fashion of the day or the trend of the day, of course, consumers will shift to the substitute. Switching cost. If switching to the substitute is very low, the cost of switching is very low, the substitute will pose a threat. But if switching to substitutes is the cost involved is high to the consumer, either monetary cost or psychological satisfaction and all that, the consumer will not switch to the substitutes. So these factors: existence first, then performance, relative price, fashion trends, and switching costs will determine how the substitute will be a threat to the product in question. Now, when there are substitute products that customers might buy from, firms must make their products more attractive than the substitutes. And when firms are able to do that, then their product will be able to pose a threat to the substitute. That is a way of beating competition from substitutes. Make yours attractive and better than your substitutes. We move on to the powers of the supplier and of the customer or consumers. Now, these powers are influenced by the forces of demand and supply. We begin with the bargaining powers of suppliers. In some industries, suppliers have considerable power. When this occurs, they might charge high prices that firms buying from them are unable to pass on to their own customers. As a result, profitability in the industry is low and the market is competitive. The bargaining powers of suppliers might be high when there are only a small number of suppliers in the market. If this is the situation, the very few or the only supplier in the market becomes powerful and can quote whatever price they want. And because their customers need them, they have no other option than to buy from that supplier. When there are no substitutes for the products that are supplied, if no substitutes exist, the product of the supplier is unique. So that is the only thing in the market and customers are forced to buy. And this makes suppliers very powerful. When the supplier's product is an important component in the end products that are made with it. If this is the situation, there is no way you can produce without buying the supplier's product because it is an important component in the end product. When this happens, there is no choice than to buy from that particular supplier. And in a situation where suppliers could easily integrate forward and enter the market as competitors of their existing customers, then the supplier becomes very powerful and has a high bargaining power. These are the points to note when looking at the bargaining power of suppliers. We must also note that the bargaining power of suppliers also depends on the importance of the product they supply. Let's take a car manufacturer for an example. For a car manufacturer, the bargaining power of engine suppliers will be greater than the bargaining power of suppliers of their driving mirrors, because without the engine, the car cannot be made or the car can't work. And obviously, the bargaining power of the supplier of engine is high because engines are a key component in the manufacturing of cars. So this is a very good example for us to understand how the bargaining power of suppliers depend largely on the importance of the product they supply. Bargaining power of customers or of consumers. We must understand that consumers or buyers can reduce the profitability of an industry when they have considerable buying power. Powerful buyers are able to demand lower prices or improved product specifications as a condition of buying. Strong buyers can also make rival firms compete to supply them with their products. Now, the bargaining power of customers might be high in the following situations. When the volume of their purchase is high relative to the size of the supplier. When the products of rival suppliers are largely the same. In a situation where the products of rival suppliers are not differentiated, the bargaining power of consumers will be high because they can easily switch to a rival supplier if their existing supplier isn't listening to them or isn't meeting their demands. When the cost of switching from one supplier to another are low, and this has a link with the previous point, if consumers can easily switch to another supplier, their bargaining power is increased. When the buyer's product is not affected significantly by the quality of the goods that it buys from the supplier, in such a situation, their bargaining power is high. Or if the product they buy is not a key component to their end product, they are not worried at all. When the buyer has full information about suppliers and prices in the market. The last point in the 5 forces is competitive rivalry. Competition within an industry is obviously determined by the rivalry between the competitors. Strong competition forces rival firms to offer their products to consumers at a low price relative to the product quality, and this keeps profitability fairly low. Competitors' rivalry might be strong when the rival firms are roughly the same size and economic strength. If the firms in the industry can rub shoulders because they are of the same size and economic strength, then competition will be strong in the industry. When there are many competitors in the industry, the rivalry between the firms is heightened. When there is only slow growth in sales demand in the market, this also stiffens the competition. When the products of rival firms are largely the same, competition is heightened and firms will have to compete on some other thing other than the attributes of the product because they are the same and they serve the same purpose. So they could then compete on price or some other features of the product, special features of the product. When the cost of withdrawing from the industry is high, so that even unprofitable companies are reluctant to leave the industry. Sometimes when the cost of entering the industry is high, the cost of withdrawing from the industry might also be high because of the level of investment that has been made. So even if firms are not making profits, as long as they are able to cover their variable costs, they will be willing to stay in the industry and compete. How do we use Porter's 5 forces in an exam situation? In our exam, we may be required to use the 5 forces model to analyze the strength of competition in the market or industry, which is the subject of the case study. First, to do this, when we have read through the case and are sure that we require Porter's 5 forces to analyze the competitive nature of the market or the industry, we need to take the 5 forces in turn. We discuss each of them in turns. the two threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, the power of the supplier, the bargaining power of suppliers and consumers, and then the competitive rivalry among the firms in the industry. We take turns and discuss each of them, taking into consideration the various factors under them. And then we consider how it might apply to the particular case study or scenario. And to do this, we look at whether it stiffens or weakens competition, and not forgetting the effect on the profits in the industry. Whether the factor stiffens or weakens the competition in the industry, and the effect this will have on profits of the firms in the industry. This is all we have for the business environment and then analyzing the industry using Porter's 5 forces. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.